Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hello and welcome to this brand new podcast. I'm Nick Blevins and I'm your host, and I'm so excited you're here with me as we kind of embark on this new journey with a new podcast designed for family ministry leaders. So if you serve or lead in children's ministry or student ministry, maybe next gen or family ministry overall at your church, this podcast is for you. And that's the world I live in. I lead the family ministry staff team at Community Christian Church in Nottingham, Maryland. And our church just turned 10 years old this year. And that's, man, I say that out loud, it's hard to believe because that 10 years has flown by so fast. And it's been an awesome ride. It's been an awesome ride. And a little bit more about myself. My wife, Jennifer, and I have been married for 11 years. So we got married, and then the next year, we're part of this new church plant that started 10 years ago. Jennifer and I have two awesome kids, Isaac and Mackenzie, and we have loved the experience we've had at our church and the 10 years that we've had. And if there's one thing I could pick out that I didn't expect to love over the 10 years and really enjoy, it's been connecting with other leaders, going to conferences, being part of a network that's in our area, all those kind of things, and just learning from other people. And that's what this podcast is going to be all about. It's going to be about having a guest on each week who serves in family ministry, and we're going to ask them, what do they do? Why do they do what they do? We're going to talk principles. We're going to talk practices, specifically. What do they do at their church? How do they do it? What are the resources and the tools they use? And so when they share resources, which we'll ask them to do every week, we'll put them in the show notes on my blog at nickblevins.com so we can, steal their great ideas and use them at our church if they fit as we tweak and kind of apply it to our context. I have to thank a number of people for helping me get this podcast rolling. My wife, Jennifer, for sure, has been a big help. You heard her voice in the bumper leading into the podcast. Carrie Newhoff, many of you know Carrie through his podcast. It is a great podcast. If you don't listen to it, you really should listen to it every week. I certainly do. Frank Beelers, the family pastor at Elevation Church. Frank will actually be our guest on the next episode. And he allowed me to use some music from their E-Kids worship album in the bumper as well. And then Kenny and Elle Campbell. Elle will be the guest today, so we'll talk with Elle, and then Kenny will be on a future podcast. But they really helped me get the podcast going. Kenny especially helped me with some of the technical stuff related to this that I was just clueless on. And last but not least, thanks to you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing it. I'd really appreciate it if you went on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever you listen to and rate the podcast there and give it a review. That helps other people hear about it. But I want to hear your feedback as well. Leave a comment in the show notes on the blog or email me on the site or whatever you want to do to let me know how I can make it better. How can we make this podcast better for you? What guests would you like to hear from who are leading out there that you'd love to learn from? What are the questions that you would like some answers to? I'd love to hear from you. As I mentioned today, our very first interview is with Elle Campbell. Elle and her husband Kenny led an amazing middle school ministry in Buffalo, New York before moving to work full-time with Orange. And they create so many helpful resources for student ministries. And you'll get to hear all about that. But with each podcast, there will be show notes posted on the blog. And all you have to do is go to nickblevins.com/episode1, for instance, for this week. And any links and resources that are shared will be found there. And we have a ton from Elle. So thanks for listening, and now here's our first interview with Elle Campbell. Well, I'm really excited to have Elle Campbell as my guest today. Elle, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Nick. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, Elle, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Elle Campbell?
Elle Campbell is me. Let's see. What can I tell you? Well, I was born and raised in Buffalo, New York. Let's see. I'm married to a boy named Kenny. We play a lot of board games. I go to coffee a lot. There's a lot of coffee in my life, probably too much. For fun, you're going to think I'm a huge dork. Your listeners are going to think I'm just a giant nerd. But
they're probably going to identify with you.
Okay,
You're going to make them feel better about themselves is what I'm thinking.
That's what I'm hoping for.
But keep going.
So in my free time, I read books. I knit, like scarves and stuff.
Wow. Okay.
I recently got into doing jigsaw puzzles. So basically,
right.
I'm kind of like a 90-year-old woman in a 20-something-year-old's body. So yeah,
cool.
That's me.
Interesting. Definitely learned some things there, even though I've known you a bit for a while. Did not know you knit.
I did. Yeah, I
that's
do,
cool.
So that's a little bit about me. Been married for 9 years now. And my husband and I, we did ministry together in Buffalo, where we both grew up. But we now live in Atlanta. We both work for Orange, which is a nonprofit that creates resources for churches. And basically, we just spend kind of all of our time at Orange and kind of as a hobby too, just kind of creating things that we hope helps church workers.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure it does. I know you and I were emailing back and forth about this podcast, and as it was, we were talking about how it's cool to have you on as one of the first guests. And you mentioned that my blog was the first blog your name was mentioned on, I guess. Is that what you said?
It was, yes. Okay, so back in, I think it was 2011 maybe, my husband Kenny and I, we were kind of on like this panel discussion that was happening at the Orange Conference during one of the breakouts, and which was like the first time I think I had ever like spoken publicly also, so that was kind of weird.
Nice.
And then I went home and I was like, oh my gosh, some guy just blogged about me. Who is this Nick Blevins guy? So there it was. It's a good memory.
He's nobody, just in case you're wondering. And for anybody listening, do not go back into my blog in 2011 because the writing is terrible. So it was mostly just, that was a great breakout, by the way. It was a breakout about like specific ideas to partner with parents, right? And Carrie hosted it, and you and Kenny were guests among some others.
Yep, that was really fun.
Yeah, and I remember we implemented probably at least two of the ideas that were shared there, as well as some of the stuff you shared on stuff you can use.org, the site you run now. So
That's
just
awesome.
For people who are listening, just go there. Don't dig through my blog and look for that post. Just head right to your site. That's cool. So when you were serving at the chapel, tell us a little bit about like how you served there as a volunteer and then becoming staff and what that looked like.
Sure. So the church that we both, my husband and I both attended and then later worked at, it was actually the church I grew up at. So I went to the same church my whole life for like 27 years. So I attended when I was in high school. I started volunteering as a small group leader. I started as a 5th grade girls small group leader. And it was an interesting time for me to start serving because it was the first time for my church that we started adopting this model of small groups and this whole idea of partnering with parents. So there's a big kind of culture shift happening for our ministry. And I got to watch that happen as a volunteer, which was really cool. So came in as a 5th grade girls small group leader, and just kind of being exposed to that model of ministry, I think is really the thing that hooked me to want to do ministry, because I saw how a consistent small group leader could really influence the life of a kid. And I was just like, man, I think I just want to do this forever. So I started serving, and then later kind of down the line that turned into a staff position. I started on our family ministry team, just kind of doing a ton of random stuff like family baptisms and like volunteer training events for all of our family ministries all together. And then 3 years after that, I switched over into a middle school specific role. And I was the volunteer and small groups coordinator for our middle school ministry. So that was like the best job ever that I didn't even realize that I wanted until I got there. Started doing it, and I was like, man, I think this is like the kind of thing I'm made to do. And it was a great experience. So I did that for 4 years, and it was a blast. We watched a ton of growth happen, a lot of really healthy culture kind of shifting happen. And it was just a really fun time to kind of learn and try new stuff and really invest in volunteers. So yeah, it was a great experience.
Okay, that's cool. That's really helpful, because you're saying basically your church kind of shifted to a small group model while you were there, and you were a volunteer, and then you went to staff. So I want to ask about that a little bit more, because so you co-authored the book Lead Small Culture, which is a great book. I think every ministry leader in children's ministry or student ministry should read that, along with Lead Small. So maybe some of the principles in that book too, you got to lead through at the chapel. But so what did that look like transitioning, from not having that model to that model specifically in student ministry? Sure.
So there were really kind of two shifts that sort of happened, which I can kind of differentiate a little bit between those. The first one was really the implementation of a small groups model, which happened for me when I was serving in high school. So like I said, I was a 5th grade girls small group leader. And up until that point, we had what we called small groups, but really they were just kind of discussion groups. We didn't have consistent small group leaders. Those leaders weren't really investing in kids outside of church. It was more of just rally these kids together and try to keep them under control for a few minutes at the end of the message. So that's kind of what I grew up in as well. So that was the model we had. And then we really tried to begin shifting this vision to be like, hey, small group leaders, like you are not just volunteers, you're not just discussion leaders, but we want you to see yourselves as pastors and to really be the youth pastors of your small group. And so for me, hearing that as a 17-year-old volunteer, I was like, oh my goodness, like that's crazy, but it's also so empowering. And so for me, not every volunteer at the time really latched onto that idea, which is kind of just par for the course when you're kind of shifting vision, I think. But for those of us who did, I think we really saw like a pretty significant change in the way that volunteers saw their role in our church. We really took on more responsibility willingly because we realized that suddenly we had this job that like really, really mattered. And we were just bought in. So we saw a lot of really cool stuff happen. But that was kind of that first shift. And that was maybe, what was that? Like 11 years ago?
Okay.
Something like that. So we did that. And for sure, there was like, it was a little tumultuous, kind of like anytime you make a big change. We lost some volunteers, but we gained other ones. You know how that goes. So we did that, and we're just kind of building that small groups model for a bunch of years. Probably about 7 years after that, maybe a little less, maybe like 5 or 6, somewhere in there, we started to hit some growing pains because our church had grown so much. So we had really instituted like the structure, I think, that would allow small groups to thrive, meaning we had consistent small group leaders, and these leaders were kind of committed to the same group over multiple years. But the issue that we started to face was that we had so many small group leaders that our staff wasn't able to really invest in them the way that they needed to be invested in. Because, I mean, this thing happens when you convert to this small groups model. It's like, you need to be able to pastor the small group leaders so that the small group leaders can pastor students, which is a big shift. And so as we grew, our staff was kind of, just pulled in too many directions, trying to figure out how to keep programming running, but also investing in these people. And it just became really difficult. So we finally realized, okay, we need to start staffing in a way that supports small groups. And so our former staff structure, I'll give you the middle school example. We had for a long time, we had the middle school director, and then we had an assistant. I believe it was a part-time assistant. And so we switched up the whole staffing structure, and we actually just eliminated the assistant role, and we went middle school director and then small groups coordinator, which was my role. And essentially what we got then was one full-time staff person, the director, who was primarily overseeing like the large group stuff, the program, the big picture vision. And then for me, which is my role, I just got to focus entirely on the people that were serving with us and the structure of small groups. And that really was kind of that second piece of the puzzle that I think helped us really get to that healthy small groups culture that we really wanted.
That's great. That's really helpful. So I have a couple questions about what you said there, because I definitely want to get it practical, for leaders who are listening. And you said that you had one full-time middle school director, and then you were serving kind of part-time as a small groups coordinator. Is that right?
The assistant role before me was a part-time assistant role, but then they upped it to 2 full-time staff people.
Gotcha.
So that assistant actually moved over to high school ministry, and she went full-time high school only. And then I moved into middle school full-time as the small groups coordinator.
Great. Do you have any idea how many students you had then? Because that question comes up all the time. Like there are different books like Sustainable Youth Ministry that have specific, targets you can go for. But do you have any idea how many students you had at the time?
It's easier for me to estimate staff. I can try to estimate the students, but I might be a little bit, I'm sorry, not staff, but the volunteer staff. So the time that we realized, okay, we were in trouble was the time that we had probably about 65 small group leaders, because that is just way too many people for 1.5 staff people to really kind of oversee well. Yeah. So that's what we had in terms of volunteer staff. In terms of students, we probably had like, I'd say attending weekly, maybe 250.
Okay. Just in middle school?
Just in middle school.
So that's pretty good. That sounds like a pretty low staffing number. And obviously you were able to do that because you said you had a lot of small group leaders. When you said you had too many small group leaders, I bet a lot of people were thinking, I wish I had that problem.
Yeah, I know.
But that's how it works. The staff has to grow with your volunteers and all that. Yeah, that's good.
Totally. And the day that we realized we were in trouble actually was because, we had been kind of coasting for a long time with that staff structure. And our program was going really well. Like kids loved it. We were growing in terms of students. Like our attendance was just continuing to grow. And the kids loved it. But the day we realized we were in trouble and needed to make some staffing changes was the day that we had 84, I think, middle school boys show up and 2 small group leaders to cover them. And
Okay.
we were like, oh no.
Super large
like,
group.
okay,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Clearly we've been doing something wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was just a good indication for us that, yeah, we need to do a better job of focusing on our leaders and on our small groups more than just the large group programming.
Yeah. No, one quick question too. You also mentioned, obviously you transitioned to this and everybody didn't buy in.
Yeah.
And some people, did you fire them? Did they quit? I mean, how did that work?
Okay, so the first time that we transitioned to it, I was, like I said, serving as a volunteer. So I didn't see all of the craziness. I knew some of it, but not all of it. And I think it was really a mixture of all of those things. Some people quit because, and it was funny, the reasoning that people quit was that they thought the new youth pastor was lazy because he was saying, no, like small group leaders, it's your job to really disciple these kids. And so a lot of our volunteers interpreted that as, oh, he doesn't want to do his job. So that was interesting, an interesting take I hadn't thought about.
Reminds me though, it reminds me of like the
Yeah.
pastor of the 100-person church, the 150-person church, where the culture is the pastor does everything and we all know him and he provides all the care and the teaching and and it seems like the same thing just translated there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's totally what it was. And so what we were trying to get people to see, and obviously some people did, some didn't, was just that when you are able to kind of multiply your influence by empowering other people as the youth pastor, that it just allows you to grow so much more and to really have better ministry in the lives of kids. So anyway, the people who didn't get that vision, they just decided not to serve anymore, which was probably for the best for everybody. Yeah. I don't remember anybody being fired at that point. Yeah. Later down the road, when I actually transitioned into the small group leader role, leader role, I did have to fire some people, which was sad. It's never fun to fire volunteers, but when we were at a place where we just hadn't really done a good job of kind of overseeing and managing the people that we were bringing on as volunteers. So by the time I got there, we just had some really broken small groups and people who just should not have been there in the first place or who just needed to be let go. So that was hard. It was a hard shift to make. But I think once we did it, it really helped the culture quite a bit.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened from there? So you had 250 students and 60 some small group leaders, which is, really good. And obviously the ratios there are really good and all that can look great. But I would imagine those changes you put in place made it even better.
Totally. So there were really like 2 major things that we knew we wanted to tackle in that first year. So I moved over to middle school. It was me and Kenny, my husband, running the middle school ministry at that point. And the 2 things that we knew we needed was, number one, we needed to do a better job of training and just spending time with our leaders because we hadn't really done a good job of that. Like we hadn't provided a ton of ongoing training or like helpful stuff for them, both from a vision standpoint, but also from like a practical standpoint. Is that sometimes we felt like our leaders just felt a little bit kind of like hung out to dry. Like we gave them these kids, but didn't give them a ton of tools to help them figure out how to be effective. And then the second thing we really wanted to do was to elevate this idea of partnering with parents, which was something that we had talked about for years, but I don't think had really done a great job of making a reality. And so for us, we were like, it just makes sense that the small group leader is really the best solution for partnering with parents. Like if we can teach our small group leaders how to connect with parents and be a resource for them, we felt like that was really the best tool that we could really give a family in terms of partnering with parents, because we're giving them this person who can really be the link between the home and the church. So we really wanted to elevate those 2 things. So 2 things we did kind of right off the bat that really had a significant impact on our culture is the first thing, we created a small group leader handbook that just kind of detailed all of our vision, our expectations, everything that we felt like they needed to hear. And then this is kind of crazy. Like sometimes I think about the fact that we did this and I'm like, oh my goodness, how did we survive this summer? But so I came on board in July and then we, we're kicking off at, for us in the North, it was the first week of September was our kickoff. So we had, about like a little under 2 months to kind of kick off well. And so in those 2 months, we had coffee with every single one of our small group leaders, which at the time was like 65.
Okay.
So
lots of caffeine, which is apparently you like. Yeah.
I do. You're right. So I guess it was okay. But yeah, 65 in-person meetings, just one-on-ones. Sometimes a couple more. Like if we had co-leaders, we would meet with them together sometimes. But basically, we just met with every single small group leader. We walked through that whole handbook with them, clarified expectations, clarified vision, and then really just asked them like, hey, how do you feel like this is going? Are you happy? What can we do for you? So it was really kind of a give and take in these meetings of us giving them some help and them telling us, what their experience was like and how they were feeling. So those were so helpful. They really helped us kind of narrow down who our leaders would be moving forward. We found a lot of leaders who are kind of like, hey, I really need a break. So I'm glad that you asked because I would like to step down. I just need a break. And then there were other people who were like, maybe they shouldn't be in this position. Maybe this isn't the right fit for them. So there's a lot of stuff that we kind of uncovered during those meetings that was really helpful.
Okay.
So that was the first thing, doing all those meetings.
Can I ask a question there before you keep going?
Yeah, please do.
So this was sort of like you rolling out a new plan to train and care for volunteers, right? That's what it sounds like, the handbook. And the handbook, I think we got it and used it to like develop our student ministry handbook. You can get that. Anybody that's listening can get that at stuffyoucanuse.org. Is that right?
Yes, you can.
Cool.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
We put all of our ministry specific info in there, but it's all editable. So if you want to steal our language or do your own language, whatever works, you can just kind of, edit it and do what you want with it. So that was huge for us, that handbook. But then the second thing was that partnering with parents piece. And so once we had really kind of rallied all of our leaders, we saw like a lot of new energy kind of coming into our ministry because for the first time we could tell that our leaders were like, okay, they actually do care about me. They're paying attention. I now have this person the staff person who's really investing in me and who wants to know how my experience is going. So we saw a ton of like renewed energy around that. And so then we kind of tried to capitalize on that with like, hey guys, we're going to really put some big responsibility on your shoulders this year because we need you to really do a great job of partnering with parents. And so we cast a ton of vision with that. And then we created this event that was just simply a small group leader and parent breakfast. So Kenny and I, we had just been sitting down kind of talking through like, if we could do anything, what would it look like to have a successful parent partnership between our parents and our small group leaders? And kind of what we said was, well, I mean, it would be nice if they like met each other.
That helps. It's a good start.
A good step.
Yeah.
Right. And we knew that hadn't been happening to the degree that it should. So we're like, okay, well, how do we get them to meet each other? And for us, the answer is always give away free food. I feel like you can get people to do just about
good
anything
answer.
if you give them free food, right? So we planned this breakfast and we had all of our small group leaders, we printed out little invitations for them. And they actually were the people who invited the parents to this breakfast. So we didn't do any promotion for it like as a church. We only had our small group leaders personally invite parents to it. And I think we had like a 90% participation rate with our small group leaders. Some people couldn't make it just for various commitments or whatever. And I mean, the parents like packed out this place. And it was incredible. I mean, we sat there. It was maybe like an hour and a half that we had booked for this thing. And there wasn't really any programming to it. We just kind of cast some vision and we printed out we created an event kit for this too, which is also on Stuff You Can Use if you want to steal it. But we created like placemats with conversation starters and just some different stuff. And then kind of cut them loose and just said, hey, sit here, talk to each other, get to know each other, figure out how you can best help each other between parents and small group leaders. And as a staff, we kind of just got out of the way and let them do their thing. And it was ridiculous because we stood in the back of the room and we watched parents like crying, like talking to their kids' small group leaders, saying things like, I didn't realize that you were this resource for me. Like, I didn't understand that somebody cared about my kid like this. And it really had this huge impact, not only on our small group leaders, but really on our parents too. So those two things, the handbook and that breakfast, really were some pretty incredible things to start kicking off this renewed sort of culture in our ministry.
Yeah, that's powerful because most parents, especially, by the time their kids are in middle school, high school, feel alone probably. And with some of the battles they're facing, they feel like they might be the only one, especially at church, where every everybody else's kids is perfect.
Perfect.
And they're fine. And no other parent has this problem. Yeah. And I'm sure for your leaders, it made them more passionate about what they do because now they got to see parents who really need what they're offering.
Yeah, totally. And we talk a lot about, people we often hear like this question of, how do I inspire my volunteers? How do I get them to care more? And I think one thing that is really important is just helping your leaders see how significant their job is, and really putting them in this kind of environment where parents were directly telling them the kind of impact that they were making on the lives of their own kids was really huge. And it really helped our leaders kind of feel the weight of that responsibility in a really positive way.
That's great. And we actually use that same kit. We download that from you guys.
Nice.
And we did it first actually with kids, with elementary.
Oh, awesome.
So it's a little bit different, but for the most part, it was exactly the same. And then we've done that with students. We've probably done, I don't even know, 4 or 5 different like versions of that. So we even built that into our fall launch for student ministry.
That's so fun.
Yeah, it's great.
I love
It's been
that.
really, really helpful. And I think a lot of ministries have tried that. So if your ministry hasn't, I would encourage anybody to download that resource and try that out, because I think that's really helpful. I'll tell you one thing. The reason I started this podcast was so that family ministry leaders could learn from great leaders like you and Kenny, and what you're doing, what you've done, what's been successful. But before that, I did a survey to see what leaders want, right? Like what they want to hear. And there was a question that asked, like, what are the topics? List the topics you're most interested in priority order. And interestingly enough, they put small groups for kids and students, number 1, and then partnering with parents, number 2, before volunteer recruiting and volunteer training, which was kind of cool because, most ministry leaders feel they need more volunteers. And so that's usually number 1. So what we're talking about here, small groups, partnering with parents, how you train them, and hits all of them. So that's great.
Yeah. And actually, we did a similar survey with some of our people through Stuff You Can Use, and we had very similar results. I think for us, number 1 was partnering with parents. And we talk a lot about small groups, so that could have been like, I think small groups is maybe like a little bit lower on the list for us just because we already provided like a ton of stuff about it. But our top 3 for sure were partnering with parents, small groups, and recruiting. So that's really interesting. I like that.
Okay, so that's how you kind of kicked off leading and developing volunteers, training them, partnering with parents, all that kind of stuff. But what did that look like then the next year? And the next year, like, what was your plan to keep that going?
Yeah. So with the handbook, we did keep that around. We kind of refreshed it every year, and we used it as our orientation training for new small group leaders. So anytime somebody applied, we walked through that whole handbook with them straight off the bat. So that was really great. And then and every August, we would do like a big meeting with our volunteers before we kicked off the school year. And during that meeting, we would kind of just touch on any updates that we had made to the handbook, any like significant things we wanted to talk about, and kind of use that sort of as like our curriculum to really train them every year. So for sure, the handbook kept showing up. And then for the small group leader parent breakfast, that was something that we did annually as well. For us, we typically would do the small group leader parent breakfast every like early November, sometimes late October. And the reason for that was that, so we begin our school year in early September, and we wanted to give it kind of a month or so after the school year started to make sure small groups could like get solidified. Because, like kids, for whatever reason, will like switch small groups a little bit, takes a little bit to get settled. So we would let small groups settle for about a month, and then we would do the breakfast with the parents and the small group leaders. That's great. And then I think I remember when I was, on Stuff You Can Use years ago that you did like a leader retreat as well. Is that true? Yeah. So for our leader retreats, we kind of experimented with a few different rhythms. Pretty much what we landed on as the thing that worked best for us in our context was we would do 2 leader retreats a year. And we say retreat. For us, it was really just like a Saturday, like a prolonged kind of hangout with some training. Yeah. So we would do one every August. That was the school year kickoff. There's a lot of kind of general vision casting, a lot of like policies and procedures and stuff in that one. And then we would come back about 6 months later in like January, February, and we would do sort of a mid-year retreat. And for that one, we would kind of bring back some of those core vision pieces, but we leaned more heavily on like discussion and kind of community, less upfront training and more, hey, let's talk about this. Let's talk best practices, that kind of thing.
Okay. And for the most part, was that your training plan for the year? You just kept running that play?
Those were our 2 like mandatory, like everyone needs to be there kind of meetings. But then we would also supplement it with some other things. So we tried this one. I feel like we did a different rhythm every year. with what I'm about to say, but we would do these like Sunday afternoon lunches with our leaders, somewhere in the vicinity of like every other month. And with those lunches, they would always already be on campus for church. And we would just say, hey, stay after, we're going to feed you lunch. And then we're just going to do a quick training on something. And for those meetings, we would do just kind of like random one-off topics that we felt like were helpful for the time. Like we did one that got really good feedback that we talked about the developmental things that are going on in a middle schooler's brain during the middle school years. Just kind of taught them like what that means for small group and what that means for their faith formation. So we would just kind of pick these like random topics to kind of go through. And those ones were very highly encouraged, but they weren't mandatory. We would kind of create sort of like a, hey, in case you missed it, kind of PDF with a recap and stuff for people who couldn't be there. And then we would also supplement it with more like one-on-one and small group kind of hangouts. So we would do these like coffee talks where we would have just small kind of focus groups of our leaders, and we would talk best practices. We would ask them like, hey, what's something that you've tried that really worked this month? What's something that you tried that like totally bombed this month? What do you need help with? And those were awesome because they actually were our small group leaders sort of training each other, which was awesome. It was a fun kind of mix up so that our staff wasn't the only kind of crew of people training our leaders. And then we would just do one-on-one. So me hanging out with some of our female leaders, and then Kenny hanging out with our male leaders, just checking up on them, making sure they were doing well, all that stuff. So there were a bunch of kind of different styles of training that we would just mix up and kind of just try out in different rhythms to see what would work.
Yeah. Now, did you have a goal in terms of a year that like every leader got met with one time, one-on-one or anything like that?
For sure. We wanted for sure every leader to be met with at least once during that year. I would usually shoot to have some kind of conversation with somebody, maybe coffee or lunch or whatever, once a week if possible. That wasn't always possible, but I attempted it at least.
Now, I know one of the challenges ministry leaders face, regardless of whether or not it's children's ministry, student ministry, family ministry overall, is when it comes to training, if they're a gifted communicator up front and they like to write that kind of content themselves, they're fine. But if not, they're not. What content do they use? Like you mentioned, the development of middle schoolers and what that looks like. So where did you pull some of that training content from for those specific things?
Yeah, honestly, it was hard because at least back then, I feel like there wasn't a ton of material coming out so that we did have to create a lot of our own things. So let's see, the one that I mentioned about middle school development, I actually used a book from Mark Ostreicher. It's called Middle School Ministry, and he did a ton of great stuff just talking about like how a kid's brain is changing and what's going on. So a lot of it was just pulled from books I was reading. But then once the book Lead Small came out, that really revolutionized a lot of our training for us. If you're not familiar with Lead Small, it's a book from Orange. Reggie Joyner and Tom Shefchunas both wrote it together. And basically what Orange did was over the course of several months, they interviewed small group leaders like once a week. I think on like Monday nights, they would just bring crews of small group leaders in and just kind of interview them to try to figure out what does the job description of a small group leader look like. And they narrowed it down into these 5 principles. And the thing that I loved about these principles was like they really are sort of this universal job description that could work in any church context, any age group. I mean, it makes sense for a preschool small group leader and a high school small group leader. They're just kind of like sort of like if you picture them like these buckets. Like for example, one principle is be present, and like a job of a small group leader, you have to be present. You have to show up. You have to be with kids. And so really these principles kind of become these buckets that you can put any kind of training inside of. And so we use those principles once that book came out as sort of our outline and our structure for the whole year of like what we would train our leaders and when, which was awesome. But like I said, there really wasn't a ton of stuff out there. So actually so I'm now on the Orange team, and one of the things that I get to work on that I am obsessed with is this subscription site that we have called Weekly. And the whole idea of Weekly is to create ongoing training resources for church leaders to kind of take those things and then train their small group leaders with them. So we use like Lead Small as sort of our outline, and then we just create a ton of stuff like different events, different conversation guides, different meeting scripts, kind of a ton of things that you can use for any age group of small group leader to help you train them kind of like all year long. So that's cool because it's something I wish existed when I was on a church staff, but now it does. Yeah. So happy.
Yeah, it's great. And I've talked to so many ministry leaders who love weekly, and a ton of them don't use Orange. So you don't have to use Orange to use weekly. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's not curriculum specific. Although if you do use the curriculum, we tie it in pretty nicely so that you don't have to do like a ton of extra work. But if you don't use it, then just, don't use the curriculum part.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's goweekly.com.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
That's good. Yeah, because I think you said something in there that I think is key. So I want people to catch that too. I think when it comes to training volunteers or staff or whoever, it's really hard to train them if you're not learning yourself. Like you mentioned, you read that book from Mark Ostreicher, and you've probably read other books. Right. And so then what you do is you take that and you pass it on, and the format can look a number of different ways. But the key is that you're regularly learning yourself, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think before we started recording, Nick, you and I were talking about how sometimes it's important to remember that like our leaders are not thinking about church as often as we are.
I know, what's wrong? I don't get it. Like every day they should be thinking about,
Right. They should wake up in the morning thinking about church every single day. Yeah, that doesn't happen, sadly. But I think it's important to have that frame of mind when we are thinking through training with our leaders. And so because of that, the mentality that I always had was like, okay, my leaders need something really, really practical and something really inspirational. So if I can give them something that they can go do this week, but also something that'll sort of be a little bit of a pep talk for them, then that feels like a win to me. So that's kind of what I would shoot for, keeping it really simple. Like you can't take an entire book and condense it into one meeting and expect your leaders to remember everything. But there are little pieces of things that you can pull out and give it to them in little kind of digestible bites so that they can kind of go out and just, have something practical to use.
That's great. And the practical and the inspirational, that's two good handles for like what to try to give volunteers every time you're with them or every time you do a training. So we were talking about going from working full-time on the church staff to not working full-time on church staff like you've done.
Right.
So you work for Orange, which obviously is still really close to the church because you're resourcing the church. But you also volunteer at a church, right? So tell us about that and what that's been like, the change.
Sure. So I volunteer at one of the North Point campuses. It's called Browns Bridge, and I am a coach for small group leaders in the middle school ministry. So basically what that means is there's the staff, obviously, but then underneath the staff, they have this volunteer position called the small group leader coach. And it's kind of our role to just pour into and help and invest in our small group leaders. So I oversee sixth grade girl small group leaders from the 11 o'clock service. So it's sort of this really specific little segment. And those are my leaders, and I know who they are. And I know, if I'm doing it right, then I know sort of some of the issues that are going on in their groups, and I can kind of just be like a resource and a help to them. So it's actually like a cool experience for me because that's kind of what I did on staff at my last church. But now, I don't get paid for it.
Yeah, so that's a little bit different. Yeah.
It's a little different, I guess. But it's awesome because that's the part that I love. And probably the part that I missed the most not being in a church is not having that team that I get to like invest in on a regular basis. So this really helps me kind of fill some of that void that I have these leaders that I can like help and that I can serve and train and invest in.
Now, recently, I was at a gathering at Orange called Next for Next Gen pastors or family pastors, and Tom Shefchunas, the middle school pastor at North Point, talked about how which I think was great for everyone to hear because I think every church is trying to have this role but struggles with it a little bit, how they had tried twice to get that coach role in place that you serve in, and it failed both times. And then he felt like this third time it's now worked. Now, I know you haven't been there. I don't know if you've been there through all the other ones, but what would you say is helpful to making that level work in a church? So if a student ministry wants to have coaches to lead their small group leaders, what's helpful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually at my church, it's I'm not there anymore, but while I was there, we were kind of trying to get this off the ground, and we didn't get it off the ground when I was there. I believe that they're kind of still trying to do that, and they've taken some good steps toward it. But so, okay, this was kind of my plan that I think makes sense, but maybe somebody else could speak into this as well. Kind of my hope at the beginning was, like I was still struggling to have enough small group leaders to go around. So this idea of recruiting a completely new volunteer force was really difficult for me. Like, I'm like, shoot, I just don't know where these people are going to come from. So a good stepping stone, I thought, was to really look at the leaders that you have and to see, okay, which of these leaders would be great at helping assist other leaders. And some of those leaders, maybe down the line, that's going to be the only thing that they want to do. But, maybe in the meantime, they still want to be a small group leader to kids, but they also want to kind of help encourage their peers too. And so the plan that we had was, okay, well, why don't we look, like, let's say we have maybe 10 sixth grade guy leaders. Let's look at that pool of 10 leaders and let's choose one of them to sort of be like the team leader. And it can just be somebody who's a go-to person, somebody who is kind of helping coordinate some things, kind of being there as a resource. So maybe not putting them in charge of the other leaders, because that could kind of feel weird, if like for them, if a peer was suddenly elevated like over them, could feel a little strange sometimes. But kind of just making it more of like a go-to person. That could be a good sort of intermediary step before that person actually becomes a full-on coach. But the other thing you can do is you can take like a grade at a time. This is something I've heard Sue Miller talk a lot about. She is like a children's ministry volunteer all-star. She's incredible. And she actually wrote this e-single, this ebook that we have available on Amazon now. It's called Just Ask, and it's about volunteerism. And she talked about how when you're trying to create change and like, recruit new volunteers, just look at one grade and just start there. So maybe in children's ministry, maybe that means starting with the oldest kids because they might be the ones who need it the most. So if you've got like your fifth grade small group leaders, maybe recruiting a coach who will be the fifth grade coach. So you don't feel like you have to do every grade all at once, but just start somewhere and maybe just institute a coach role for one small segment and then let it grow from there.
That's good. That's good. And then in the meantime, like for a church that maybe doesn't have that position yet, or maybe just size dictates you don't even need a volunteer to do that yet,
right?
Then we as staff have to do that, right? Kind of like you did.
Exactly.
Like that's our job to fill that role until somebody can jump in there. That's good.
Yeah,
that's helpful.
Totally.
Well, that's all the questions I had, although I could talk forever. A bunch of the things you said have been really, really helpful. But one last thing I want to do is just ask you about, you and Kenny do an awesome job putting together different resources to help student ministries. We mentioned stuff you can use, but you also have the YM Answers podcast and YM Labs. So if you could tell us a little bit about those two things.
Yeah, for sure. So stuff you can use is something that we launched while we were still back at our old church. Basically, we were just creating stuff. Like we mentioned the volunteer handbook and the small group leader parent breakfast. And we were really fortunate to serve at a church where our pastor was really passionate about us helping and resourcing other churches. And so what we did was we kind of just created this website to just share some of that. And so that's what Stuff You Can Use became, stuffyoucanuse.org. We just started putting things that we were making up on our website for other people to use. And over time, that just sort of grew into some other projects that have been really fun. So a little bit over a year now, we launched our first podcast, which is called Youth Ministry Answers. And basically what it is, it's pretty simple. People call in with questions about youth ministry. And then we, Kenny and I, either us or we'll try to recruit an expert who is smarter than us. We just attempt to answer their questions about youth ministry. So it's really fun. It's really interactive. We have a ton of questions coming in from a ton of different topics. Like, so far we've talked about a lot of things. I think we have about 30 something episodes out at this point that we're recording. And we've talked about social media and we've talked about volunteerism, tons of stuff. And then most recently, we launched something called Youth Ministry Labs, which you mentioned. And that is sort of a library of video courses for youth workers, youth pastors, and their volunteer teams. So the labs, there's a few of us, and we just kind of create these short videos. They're like 15, 20 minutes max, designed to be able to show in your meetings if you want to. And they're just really practical things to give you some ideas on how to better innovate and empower leaders and just kind of be more awesome in youth ministry. Hopefully.
Yeah, that's helpful, right? We were talking about it's important to learn. And so Youth Ministry Labs is a chance to maybe do that. And like you said, 15 minutes long, that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Yeah,
I listen to YM Answers. I think it's a great podcast, even if you're not specifically just in youth ministry. I listened to the one about digital strategy for ministry, as well as even which Sunday or which day of the week is best to have your student ministry gathering on, which I know is another question that a lot of student ministers wrestle with, if they're starting it new, or maybe they've been doing it and some of the momentum has gone. Yeah, that's a tough one. So yeah, that's a great podcast. Well, Elle, really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. This has been really, really helpful. Thank you so much.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right. That was great, wasn't it? I know there are so many leaders who are either transitioning to small groups with kids or students, or maybe you've done it for a while, but you're always looking for some new ideas. And we all want new ideas for partnering with parents. It just feels like something that we're still experimenting with. It feels so new. So it was good to hear Elle's thoughts on that. Our church, no lie, has probably used every resource that was mentioned in the interview that Kenny and Elle create. And you can get links to those and anything else at the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 1. Again, I'd love for you to head over to iTunes and leave a rating and comment and let me know what you think. Please share it with friends on social media. And while you're on iTunes, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. Same goes for Stitcher if you prefer that app. Next week, we talk to Frank Beeler from Elevation Church about how to help volunteers lead like staff. We all want volunteers who lead like staff, and at Elevation Church, it's not just theory. It's not something they talk about. It's something they actually do, and Frank shares some practical ways they do it. So hit subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.